Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Ferdinand de Saussure's The Nature of the Linguistic Sign. So this is an excerpt from what's generally considered, I would say, Saussure's masterpiece, the course in General Linguistics. I've actually read the course in General Linguistics, but since I'm not a linguistics person, A, I found it quite challenging. B, I don't have the time to reread it. C, I read it long before I started making YouTube videos about virtually everything that I read. So I'm not going to go back to it. But the nature of the linguistic sign is a small piece from the course in General Linguistics, and I'm reading it out of Bedford St. Martin's The Critical Tradition, which is a critical and literary theory reader. So, nature of the linguistic sign basically gives you the sort of key building blocks of one of semiotics' most important insights. So, semiotics is the study of signs, the way in which meaning is made by reference to things that signal other things or signal concepts, ideas, whatever it is. So linguistics obviously is sort of central in this, but semiotics is also a sort of larger analytical discipline. Saussure himself was a linguist. He was sort of central to the development of what we call structuralism, which is a philosophical or critical idea in which analysis of the structures through which meaning is made within societies is the central focus. So it's very, again, analytical. It looks at the different pieces or components or elements of something like a text. And in the sort of Derridian sense, text can include almost anything. But when we think about structuralism in my field of literary studies, we're thinking about it in terms of like the study of pieces of poems, say literary devices in poetry or fiction or drama or whatever it is, right, within written texts. And Saussure is sort of foundational to this. And in Nature of the Linguistic Sign, he lays out one of the most important concepts of structuralism and of linguistics and of semiotics, which is that there is a disjunction between the two sort of key terms that Saussure introduces are the signifier and the signified. Now, to back it up just a little bit, the thing that sort of prompts Saussure to do this is what he calls this naive understanding that most people have of how language works. So what he starts by saying is, some people regard language, when reduced to its elements, as a naming process only, a list of words, each corresponding to the thing that it names. For example, and he's got this lovely little graph here. There's a tree, a horse, a quest. Right? So what he goes on then to say is, this concept is open to criticism at several points. It assumes that ready-made ideas exist before words. It does not tell us whether a name is vocal or psychological in nature. Arbor, for instance, can be considered from either viewpoint. Finally, it lets us assume that the linking of a name and a thing is a very simple operation, an assumption that is anything but true. But this rather naive approach can bring us near the truth by showing us that the linguistic unit is a double entity, one formed by the association of two terms. And what he then goes on to say is, the linguistic sign unites not a thing and a name, but a concept and a sound image. So the naive view that Saussure is responding to is basically that words mean what they mean. That's about the extent of the naive view, right? So the idea that, like, and in some ways this is sort of a Platonic idea, right? That sort of Plato's concept of ideal forms undergirds this way of looking at the world, because Plato basically had this idea that there is an ideal form of everything, the Platonic form, as we now call it, although I don't think Plato called it that. But the Platonic form is sort of the ideal form, and then every existing version of a thing is an imperfect instantiation of that ideal. So my cat, Frank, for instance, as much as he's awesome and I love him, he is an imperfect, according to Platonic philosophy, he is an imperfect instantiation of the Platonic ideal version of cat. My kitchen table, I think, is a pretty cool kitchen table. It's nicely decorative. It is an imperfect version of the Platonic ideal of kitchen table, right? This is across the board sort of the foundation of Platonic philosophy. And what this assumes is that a cat is a cat by virtue of being a cat, right? Like that the thing is self-identical. And philosophically, that's not inherently a problem, right? We can agree, disagree with that on a philosophical level, but on a linguistics level, the idea that a cat is a cat because it's a cat obscures the actual functioning of language, according to Saussure, right? But what he does say, the benefit of starting to think about this from a naive perspective, is that it raises these questions about what we're doing when we name something in language. And again, what he says is that the sign, the linguistic sign, that is the way in which a concept or an idea or an object or whatever it is named, blends these two different components. What he initially calls the concept, that's the thing as such, sort of the Platonic ideal, and the sound image. So sound image is a slightly linguistics-y term that basically means whatever it is that a particular language or language group, dialect, whatever it is, uses to indicate that concept, right? So I say the word cat. If you are an English language speaker, an Anglophone speaker, then you will probably have some concept of cat. And this is where it starts to get really interesting, right? Because what you picture by cat will likely be different from what I picture. The first thing, when I think of cat, the first thing that I think of is my cat, Frank. That is probably not the first thing that you think of. Maybe you have your own cat. Maybe you had a cat when you were a kid, whatever it is. Maybe your neighbor has a cat, whatever it is. Maybe you're picturing a fucking cartoon cat, right? Like Tom and Jerry, whatever it is, right? So we picture different things. And so the concept of cat is not linked specifically to one clearly delimited thing. It is, in fact, expansive, right? So this is the idea of the concept. But what Saussure then proposes is a different set of terminology. And this is where Saussure's contribution really comes in. He introduces these. So the term sign is one of his big three that he uses here. Sign predates the course in General Linguistics. It was something that was already being used in linguistics prior to Saussure coming along, but he introduces two new terms that become the standards, right? So, and the reason that he does this is he argues that the terms concept and sound image are too ambiguous. And so he gives a more scientific set of terms that specifically reflect their relationship to one another, right? And this was a big thing. In a late 19th century, early 20th century, there's a big push in certain quarters to make the study of literature, culture, language, etc., more scientific. And so Saussure is part of this broader sort of movement. And so he introduces these two concepts, the signifier and the signified. So the signified is the thing that is represented. It takes the place in Saussure's formulation of the concept, right? My cat is a signified, right? It is represented by something. On the other hand, the signifier now becomes the sort of replacement for the sound image, right? The signifier is whatever it is that linguistically stands in for the thing that is being signified, right? So the terms signifier and signified signal that relationship, right? They indicate that relationship in a way that the terms concept and sound image do not. They simply don't directly connect to one another on a linguistic level, on a sound level, and so these terms become the default. The other thing that Saussure points out that I think is incredibly important to emphasize, and it's included in this version, is part 2 of Nature of the Linguistic Sign, principle 1, the arbitrary nature of the sign. And this is, again, a really important thing because this sort of resists the Platonic philosophical conception of language in which a thing is named what it is named because that is what it is, right? This sort of self-identification of the thing and the term. And the fact that there are multiple languages that have different terms for the same thing in those different languages is immediate evidence that that this is not how language works, right? But what Saussure argues is that within a language, once the signifier and signified are united, once they are sort of locked together, they cannot easily be unlocked, right? Those terms cannot easily be disconnected, but the locking together of particular linguistic terms is largely arbitrary. And what he means by that is that the way that language sort of originates and creates meaning, is derivative, is evolutionary, is sometimes arbitrary, etc., right? So this is a really important point in terms of understanding the nature and the evolution of linguistics, is that because things are arbitrary, because the linkage of particular signifiers and particular signifieds is arbitrary, they do evolve and change over time. And that can be the subject or the object of study for linguists.